Excellent. Well, I'll start by thanking the comrades from Speak Out Now for the invitation and the opportunity. I spoke at another Speak Out Now event quite recently on the same topic, and my talk today is going to be an updated and expanded version of that presentation. I hope that's not overly repetitious for any of you who were at that previous meeting. And a written version of this presentation has also been published online by the Tempest Collective based in the US, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. So as Eden mentioned in their introduction, I'm going to be talking about the strike wave that's happening at the moment in the UK. And the first thing I want to stress about it is what we might call its generational significance. It's the most significant and sustained upsurge in workers' struggle, not just in my political lifetime, but in my lifetime. 2022 saw the highest level of strikes in the country since 1989. And the wave has spread significantly beyond the British labour movement's remaining bastions, which are mostly concentrated in the public sector and privatised formerly public services such as transport or the postal service. So the strike wave spread well beyond that into private sector workplaces, including in an echo of a quite significant development in the US labour movement into Amazon warehouses. The wave has involved all sorts of workers, so railway workers, including on the London Underground where I work, bus drivers, postal workers, telecoms workers, civil servants, ambulance workers, nurses, NHS physiotherapists, education workers in colleges and universities, teachers in schools, charity workers, dockers, trial lawyers, food production workers, oil refinery workers, Amazon workers, as I just mentioned. I mean, the list goes on. That's really only a kind of partial cross-section. So this is of both generational significance and something that's really touching a wide cross-section of the economy. The major update, I guess, since the last time I spoke to Speak Out Now meeting is that, again, as was mentioned in the introduction, on the 1st of February, we saw some of the most extensive coordination and synchronization of strikes since the wave began, with around 500,000 workers, including civil servants, school teachers, university workers, train drivers, and others, striking together. And this is a really important step towards possibly even wider coordination and potentially a kind of de facto general strike. So we see in what happened on the 1st of February and the opportunities that creates for further coordination, the potential to consolidate a series of parallel but separate disputes into a kind of generalized class-wide fight back against the government and for social transformation. Now, having said that, each dispute still has its own logic and dynamic and needs to be fought on its own terms. And there's also a risk of seeing a mass coordinated strike like the 1st of February as a sort of culmination rather than a step in an ongoing process. And if it's seen as a culmination and, victory doesn't very swiftly follow, as it's probably not going to off the back of just one day of coordinated strikes, then there's a risk that it has a sort of demobilizing and disempowering effect. So there are risks and pitfalls, but having said all that, 1st of February was certainly an extremely important and exciting development in the strike wave so far that, as I say, brings with it a lot of potential. So just to kind of talk about the sort of backdrop to all of this, the sort of historical backdrop, I suppose, for anyone who's grown up in Britain since the defeats suffered by the trade union movement at the hands of Thatcherism in the 1980s, the current strike wave represents the re-emergence of organised labour as a visible social force. So to put that into some context for you, the second half of the 2010s saw some of the lowest levels of strikes in all of British history. The year from 2017 to 2018 saw strikes at their lowest ever level since strike statistics begun to be recorded. So this is an extremely dramatic upsurge relative to a real low point just a few years ago. And for socialists in the labour movement, those of us whose political worldview is structured around the belief that the working class is the primary agent of social change, the struggles in which we're now participating and hoping to help to victory are an opportunity to educate a new generation of activists in that worldview. If you're somebody who stresses working class agency as the prime motor of social change for the last period, it's been quite hard to convince people of that when there's not a lot of struggle happening. But now you can talk about working class struggle as an agent of social change, and you can tell people to look out of their window and they can see some, or hopefully are participating in some in their own workplace. So just to speak a little to my own personal experience, I work on London Underground. That's the subway in London, as I'm sure many of you know, and I'm what's called a customer service assistant. That's a sort of frontline station worker, and I've worked on London Underground for 9 years. And in 2022, I was on strike as frequently as I had been in all of the preceding years combined. So that's, again, to give you some sense of the scale of what's going on now. We're still a bit of a way off from flying the red flag over the tube station where I work, but there is definitely an atmosphere in the workplace that I haven't experienced before. And even in a relatively well-organized industry like mine, where union density is much higher than the average across the economy, and where our union has a relatively more militant culture than some other unions, many workers' relationship to the union can still be quite transactional. It's seen as insurance for your job. There's a kind of protective, almost kind of conservative relationship with the union, where it's seen as an external body to which you pay a fee in exchange for being rendered a service that will give you kind of legalistic protection in some sense. Against the backdrop of this strike wave, I can see the arguments that we make as socialists, and many of you probably make in your own workplaces, arguments about the union being a weapon in our hands rather than a service or a product that we're purchasing. I can see those arguments start to click. One of the big outstanding questions that the strike wave poses is whether it's going to translate into a more sustained revival of union organization, especially at workplace level. And that obviously depends on a number of factors, including whether the strikes win their demands or not. But there's certainly significant potential in this moment for that kind of revival. So to give you a bit more statistical and historical context, the UK labour movement now is about half the size it was at its peak. So in 1979, 1980, there were around 14 million workers in Britain in unions, and there are now around 7 million. Union density across the whole economy is less than 25%, so less than 1 in 4 workers are in unions. In the public sector, around 58% of workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements, but in the private sector, it's only around 14. So as I mentioned earlier, union density tends to skew very heavily in the public sector. So there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to go on, and the strike wave is hopefully going to impel some of that rebuilding in a more sustained and ongoing way. Most, although not all, of the current strikes centre around demands for higher pay. Some of them, like disputes on the railway and in the postal service, and in fact on London Underground, where I work, where our dispute is not about pay at all at the moment. Some of them are also kind of defensive struggles against attempts by employers to cut jobs, reduce staffing levels, and radically restructure working arrangements. The immediate backdrop to the strike wave, which has given most of the strikes, particularly the pay strikes, much of their sort of immediate social impulsion, is skyrocketing inflation and living costs that have seen the value of workers' wages plummet, even as top bosses' pay has gone up and the rich have continued to very significantly increase their wealth. And that's an acceleration really of a longer historical trend of a decade plus period of wage stagnation in Britain, that according to the think tank, the Resolution Foundation, has cost workers on average about £15,000. So the average worker's pay is about £15,000 behind where it should be if we hadn't have had this period of wage depression and stagnation. And on current trends, real wages are not expected to return to pre-2008 levels until 2027. And an analyst in the Financial Times, the newspaper most of you are probably familiar with, it's the sort of paper of the sort of serious, rational wing of the ruling class. It's a good paper to read if you're a revolutionary socialist, because it kind of plugs you into sort of serious ruling class thinking. And an analyst in the Financial Times called the strike wave the inevitable result of a decade of Tory austerity, which has included the underfunding of the National Health Service, a decline in services and this wage stagnation that I mentioned. So this is the kind of capitalist normality that the strike wave seeks to challenge, the orthodox assumption that economic downturns should be paid for by workers via wage depression and cuts to jobs and services. So for all of this immense potential and the immense opportunity the strike wave presents to rebuild workplace organization and class power, really, as a first sustained resurgence in workers' struggle for a very long time, starting from a very low organizational base, as I mentioned with those statistics, the strike wave also contains faltering and missteps. Although we have seen in the strike wave the reappearance of the indefinite strike as a tactic, just going on strike and not going back until you win your demands, that's still the exception rather than the rule. And many union leaders have argued for a review of disputes as a marathon, not a sprint. That's a very common phrase that you will hear union leaders and officials use to kind of talk about the sort of strategy that they're advocating. So disputes are talked about as a marathon, not a sprint, and that you need a sort of steady hand. And many union leaders have preferred, at least in the initial phases of disputes, sporadic strikes of 24 or maybe 48 hours at a time, often with weeks or even months in between rounds of action. But where workers have made gains in the current wave, and there have been some disputes that have won, it's not been through this more cautious approach, but rather through a sustained, harder hitting action, sometimes, as I mentioned, including indefinite strikes. So in the current strike wave, bus drivers, dock workers, and barristers, trial lawyers have won fairly significant wage increases, and they're the groups of workers that have taken the most sustained action, including sometimes indefinite strikes. So as any of you who are active in workplace organizing and in the labor movement will know, every industrial dispute, every strike contains a debate, more or less explicit, given depending on the conditions in a given industry and union, about its direction and strategy. And to a significant extent, we're confronting, in our strike wave, we're confronting the weight of history and trying to dig ourselves out from underneath years of defeat. So a generation ago, the indefinite strike was a kind of standard trade union tactic. And I think trade unionists who cut their teeth in previous strike waves probably see a strike wave based on sporadic 24-hour strikes as a bit timid. But the defeats that Thatcherism inflicted on organized labor, including significantly the very severe legal restrictions placed on the right to strike, which I'll talk about more later, kind of pushed consciousness and confidence back. So we have a situation now where people come to expect industrial disputes to consist of that kind of quite sporadic and cautious pattern of action. Striking is often seen as a sort of protest, something that you undertake for a strictly limited time period, as I say, maybe 1 or 2 days, often reactively in opposition to something the employer is doing. Very, very few disputes are won that way, but there's a sort of self-reproducing dynamic there where union leaderships go for this more cautious strategy because they don't think workers will be prepared to strike for longer, having been conditioned over years into this kind of strike as protest way of thinking about industrial action, with the obvious effect that that way of thinking is rarely meaningfully challenged. It is being challenged now. And this is one of the other very many important and hopeful things about the strike wave, that it's shaking up a lot of a lot of the aggregated orthodoxies that have concressed around a trade union thinking in this period of marginalization and defeat. So as I mentioned, various groups of workers in the strike wave have taken indefinite action, and others, including dockers at Liverpool and Felixstowe docks, which are two really economically significant container ports that a lot of Britain's container traffic goes through, have taken really sustained action, like striking for 2 weeks at a time. As I've said just a few moments ago, invariably those workers have made bigger gains than workers in disputes where leaderships have pursued a more cautious strategy of striking only sporadically for a day or two at a time. Now, having said all that, it's important to stress that on the whole, the present dynamic within the strike wave is not one of a consciously and consistently militant rank and file that really wants to go on strike for a long time, being constrained by a conservative bureaucracy that's determined to sell out or sabotage disputes. Union officials and leaders, even the more cautious ones, I think are undoubtedly sincere in their desire to make gains from strikes, even if some are reticent about strategy and also around even around making specific concrete demands. They prefer to kind of give themselves what they call room to maneuver in negotiations. So we're not talking about a kind of burgeoning independent rank and file that's being held back by this cautious bureaucracy. Nevertheless, the sort of general cautiousness of the leadership makes gains less likely. And there's an important, urgent need to develop rank and file workers' confidence and, crucially, a conception of ourselves. And this is something I'd want to underline and stress, really, a conception of ourselves as organizers of our own strikes rather than loyal foot soldiers whose job is to sort of carry out a strategy that's determined by someone else. Many of the current national strikes are substantially sort of top-down affairs, with the strategy almost entirely determined by union leaderships, with the mass membership's role being to, as I say, to kind of dutifully carry out those strategies rather than to shape and direct them. Changing that implies, I would argue, in the first instance, a struggle for democratic reforms within unions to establish structures such as rank and file strike committees, and to activate democratic structures where they already exist. And if we can't persuade our workmates that our own unions are something we could actively democratically control, then the claim that workers could democratically control the running of society is always going to seem like an impossible horizon. A particular practical issue here, which I'd be interested to hear your experiences with, is the question of how negotiations themselves are conducted. In the strike wave and in trade union practice, typically in Britain, these are often behind closed doors affairs, with unions negotiating teams restricted to full-time officials and union staffers, sometimes people who aren't even directly elected by the membership. And this rather opaque setup can make it difficult for rank and file members to properly scrutinise and keep tabs on what's going on in the talks, which makes it harder to develop alternative strategies from below. Now, again, to stress, I'm not suggesting that union officials are secretly working with the bosses behind the scenes to sabotage or sell out strikes. And obviously, in any mass organisation with any kind of structural hierarchy, there's always going to be some imbalance in terms of immediate access to information. But the endeavour of democratic leadership, I would argue, should always be to keep any such imbalance to an absolute minimum and ensure decision-making power is placed as close to the ground as possible. And I know that the practice of open bargaining, where rank and file workers attend negotiation meetings as well as union officials, even if only to observe, is more common in the US than in Britain, where it's practically unheard of. So if any of you have any experience with that, it would be interesting to hear about it. So I said that I'd come back to the question of legal restrictions, which is one of the things that shapes all trade union activity and organising within Britain, and is very much a immediate feature of what's going on now. So it's important to discuss. Britain has perhaps it's not an exaggeration to say, I think that Britain has probably the most restrictive legislative regime around union organising and strikes of any democratic country. It would take up too much time to give you a comprehensive rundown of all the details of those restrictions, but they are very significant and very heavy. And that legislative regime is essentially a kind of legacy of working class industrial and political defeat. Those were laws that were imposed by Tory governments to consolidate their own class war victories. And the present government is very much continuing in that tradition. It's attempting to cut off the strike wave effectively by introducing new laws to restrict strikes. The first set of laws they're introducing, which is already fairly far down the road of a parliamentary process, is a law to impose minimum service levels in a variety of sectors. So what this law would do is give either the employers or the government, or some combination of employers and government, the power to set a minimum service level in a variety of sectors, including transport, where I work, to designate certain employees It's not clear exactly how this would work, possibly by name, we're not sure, as part of that minimum service complement during strikes, this is. And then if you're designated as part of the minimum service complement during the strike and you don't come to work, you decide to take part in the strike, you then lose the legal protection from dismissal that is currently afforded to you in British law. So basically, if you're designated as part of the minimum service requirement and you strike, your employer would have the power to sack you. There's a burgeoning campaign around this in the movement. The 1st of February was also declared by the TUC, which is the Trades Union Congress, kind of our equivalent of the AFL-CIO, as a day of action against the threat of new laws. And we'll need to expand that. We need specific campaigning against the laws, in opposition to laws before they're passed, as a prerequisite to developing the confidence and organisation to defy them if and when they are implemented. So this kind of takes me into the question of this political context for the strikes and its relationship to and effect on politics, which I'll say a bit about now. So throughout the strike wave, the Labour Party, which is the only governmental alternative to the Tories, we have a two-party system in effect in Britain. And as the name suggests, was a party founded by and based on organised labour. Throughout the strike wave, the Labour Party has at best dithered. It's called for negotiations to resolve the issues that are posed by the strikes and says that it backs the right to strike, but has never really supported strikers' demands. And at worst, leading figures in the party have positioned themselves explicitly against the strikes, maintaining a quite long and ignoble tradition of Labour Party leaderships siding against workers' action. How am I doing for time, by the way? Just to check on that.
We start about 5 minutes after, so maybe a couple more minutes.
Okay, I will try and pick up my pace. So the Labour Party had a much more left-wing leadership from 2015 to 2019 under Jeremy Corbyn, which certainly used warmer words about trade union action, but still did relatively little to organise the energies that it inspired into any effort to revive struggles on the industrial terrain, to kind of make Labour into the party of strikes. Indeed, it did relatively little to organise those energies into very much at all beyond electoral work. We've now got a leadership in the Labour Party that is, in Labour terms, much more right-wing, and a lot of that energy has kind of dissipated in despair. The question of whether socialist political activity within Labour is desirable or even possible is a point of contention within the socialist left in Britain. And that's something we might discuss. My own view is that Labour and its link to the unions remain quite an important terrain of struggle. I'm sure this is already well understood by people in the meeting, but just to make it explicit, our Labour Party is a qualitatively different political formation to the Democratic Party in the USA. The relationship with organised labour is very different historically and today. So there's a kind of different terrain there, and I think that sustained self-assertion by Labour-affiliated unions within party structures could lead to transformative ferment. Okay, so some words in conclusion then, and apologies for running slightly over time. Although some union leaders in the strike wave have stressed the current disputes as what they call industrial relations matters, so emphasising them as primarily economic struggles over immediate workplace issues such as pay, which they are, but they're not just that. The strike wave has had an inevitably political character from the start. At root, it poses questions of social inequality, questions of how public services such as healthcare, transport, and education are organised and funded, and ultimately the fundamental question of whether the logic of the boss's bottom line should hegemonize economic and social life. And these are questions that can't be resolved solely around a union bargaining table. Addressing them requires political action and social transformation. So to give you some practical insights into this, on the railway, the government subsidises and compensates private train companies to offset revenue lost during strikes. So the strikes necessarily have to address the question of how the industry is organised and run, and seek to impel a wider movement for real social ownership of transport. And similarly, in our National Health Service, which is kind of part privatised now in many ways and is facing its worst ever crisis in terms of underfunding and understaffing, an upsurge in political mobilization to demand the full renationalisation and proper funding of healthcare has to accompany and fuse with NHS workers' strikes. The legal situation touches on this as well, because strikes in Britain have to be based on what's called a trade dispute between unions and employers, and that's a legal requirement designed to outlaw or at least seriously restrict strikes for explicitly political demands. Despite this, the strike wave can and must be seen as a movement for reshaping British society around all those questions that I talked about previously. For socialists and other radicals active in the strike wave, in our own workplaces and unions and in our wider political work, our first duty is to fight every battle through to its conclusion and seek to help it win. But it's also up to us to develop the rank and file organisation that can underpin a sustained revival of democratic class struggle trade unionism, and wherever possible to expand the horizons of the strike wave towards a confrontation with the rule of profit and a struggle for working class political, economic and social power. Now that horizon remains far off, and the current wave may recede before anything like that is reached, but the prospects and opportunities for building towards it now are better than they have been for a generation, and socialists in the labour movement must do whatever we can to realise those opportunities. I'll leave it there. Thank you.